Hello. The title of my talk is On Old Age, Suffering and Unbearable Suffering. For some people, life can seem so filled with suffering that they would rather end it. Such feelings are more common towards the end rather than the middle of life. Unsurprisingly, suicide occurs almost always and everywhere, more frequently in later life. But not just the act, thoughts of and wishes for death more often preoccupy the mind as people grow older. And suffering, it would seem, has always been aligned with age. This is illustrated in the sayings of the Egyptian vizier Ptahhotep, who many thousand years ago bemoaned the fate of old age. Old age has descended, he wrote. Woe is come, and weakness is renewing itself. The heart passes the night in pain every day. The eyes are shrunk, the ears made deaf. Strength now perishes. The aim of this paper is to consider this question of suffering in later life, to make some sense of the idea not just of suffering, but of unbearable suffering, and what this might mean in terms of the modern movement advocating a right to die. While suicide may be the response of a small minority of older persons, the fact of the matter is that the means of ending life are not readily to hand in old age. The perceived outcomes are often uncertain, and the necessary physical and mental capacity to complete the act may be lacking, despite the intensity of the desire to end it. For some, therefore, seeking medical assistance to die seems a safer and surer way of reaching their goal. In most countries, suicide has been decriminalised. Assisting a suicide, however, remains a criminal offence in most jurisdictions. There are, however, a growing number of exceptions. In Australia, in Belgium, in Canada, Colombia, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and in some of the United States of America. Here, assisted suicide, often referred to as physician-assisted dying, is legally permitted. But such assistance is made available only under a tight set of conditions, ensuring that there is a clear distinction between legitimate medical practice and acts that are deemed not medical assistance, but aiding and abetting self-murder. Several conditions are required in making this distinction. Notably, the rationality of the decision maker, the qualification and professional standards of the decision taker, and the bearability and tractability of the suffering that is involved. The present paper focuses primarily on this latter issue, the tolerability and tractability of suffering in later life. It leaves aside, as far as possible, questions concerning the competence of the person seeking assistance and the necessary qualifications of the person providing that assistance. In exploring suffering, it focuses upon its intensity, assessing the degree of suffering, its form, what state or condition defines that suffering, and how these two criteria of intensity and form interact in constituting the grounds for the tolerability and tractability of suffering. The paper is divided into three sections. In the first, I considered the general issue of assessing suffering as a matter of degree, and the reliability and validity of such assessments. In the second, I considered differences in the forms of suffering. And in the third, I considered whether later life, or old age, constitutes what some have called an enabling script that somehow renders more permissible and understandable ending or seeking to end one's life. I conclude with a very brief consideration of whether or not assisted dying in such circumstances may yet be compatible with religious faith. While pain measurement has been the subject of considerable research in medicine, little attention has been paid to assessing suffering. Although the relief of suffering underlies almost all aspects of medicine and surgery, unlike pain, it does not form the basis for any medical speciality. Still, it is surprising that so few attempts have been made to measure the suffering that patients experience, especially as judgments of insufficient suffering are among the more frequently cited reasons for denying applications for assisted deaths. In a review by Krikorian and his colleagues conducted some 5 years ago, 10 scales for assessing suffering were identified, designed for medical and nursing staff to assess suffering in advanced or terminally ill patients. None of these scales, however, has had widespread application, and tests of their psychometric adequacy, judged by their reliability and validity, have been largely confined to the field of palliative medicine. Here, interventions need to be evaluated in terms of their capacity to relieve physical pain and psychic distress associated with terminal illness, and evidence is required of their ameliorative effects in order to ensure best practice. But in the context of medically assisted suicide, judging the severity of suffering in terms of bearability is a rather different matter. Here, establishing a necessary consensus between the patient's own judgment of their suffering as unbearable and the clinician's judgment of the validity of that judgment is crucial. Central to this issue is the contrast between what might be called the object and subject position of suffering, and the extent to which the law requires not so much a psychometrically validated assessment of suffering as a view of unbearable suffering that is consensually derived between the suffering expressed as a subject or first-person position and the extent to which that subject position is objectively witnessed and objectively accepted by the observing clinician. Here, one can distinguish between two ways of thinking about suffering: the subjective account, associated with Eric Cassel, and the objective account, as outlined, for example, by Stan van Hooft. For Cassel, suffering is, quote, an affliction of the person, not the body. It forms a specific state of distress that occurs when the intactness or integrity of the person is threatened or disrupted. In this framework, it is the totality of suffering, its capacity to threaten the integrity of the person, that matters most, not the source or the form or the dimensions through which such suffering arises. Van Hooft rejects this subject position. He argues that suffering can be observed independently of subjectivity through a number of domains which he refers to as aspects of the Aristotelian person with its 4 types of soul, which, in modern parlors, could be thought of as a person's biological functioning, their emotional and desiring functions, their practical and rational lives, and their sense of the meaning of their existence. Without accessing the suffering experience itself, or even acknowledging the existence of any subjectivity, suffering can be separately observed and judged. Medicine's role, Van Hooft adds, should be confined to intervening in those aspects of suffering that can be observed to affect a person's biological and emotional functioning. This requires no subjectivity, no consciousness even on the part of the person observed, and ultimately no necessary humanity, for it can be applied equally to terminally ill human beings as it can to laboratory animals. The further, however, that one moves from Van Hooft's domain of biological functioning towards Cassell's holistic appraisal, the greater the scope there is for disagreement over what is intense or severe or unbearable suffering. Is it better, then, to distinguish suffering not through its quantitative intensity, but rather through the different forms that suffering can take? Cassell proposed that threats to the integrity of the person form the essence of human suffering. Such threats, for him, can arise from the body and the mind, and indeed from any condition that threatens the integrity of the person, be they somatic, psychic, or some combination. This position that similar degrees of suffering arise from conditions affecting the body and the mind has been acknowledged in recent judgments in connection with assisted dying in Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, recognizing that persons suffering from psychiatric conditions are equally eligible as persons suffering from somatic disease for physician-assisted death. That under the law, all forms of suffering are judged equal. Objections to extending eligibility for physician-assisted dying to persons with psychiatric disorders concern less the assessed severity of their suffering than the question of its terminality and tractability. Reluctance to extend physician-assisted dying to persons whose suffering arises primarily from psychiatric conditions is not largely because of the lack of terminality. It comes from the uncertainty over the potential tractability of these conditions. After all, years of intense psychic pain may be every bit as unbearable, if not more so, than months or weeks of intense physical suffering associated with an inoperable cancer. While the latter may be widely acknowledged as inoperable and the associated pain largely incapable of significant amelioration, ruling out any recovery from depression feels to many clinicians a decision too difficult to make. At the same time, tractability possesses its own potential for added suffering. Successive treatment interventions, with each apparent prospect of recovery being dashed within weeks or months by yet a further relapse, may render life as unbearable or even more unbearable than if no relief had ever been afforded. What then of age? Most assisted deaths associated with psychiatric conditions tend to be of people of working age. But the vast majority of assisted deaths are not associated with psychiatric conditions, and they are of people of retirement age or over. Does this mean that suffering is harder to bear in later life? Or that conditions causing suffering increase with age? Or is it that the sheer weight of years itself bears down upon persons, adding, as it were, yet a further element to their suffering? In addressing this question, a third form of suffering can be proposed, what a number of writers have called existential suffering, induced by the weight and purposelessness of life itself. Akin to psychic pain and suffering, in the sense employed by Cassell, existential suffering describes less the presence of pain than the absence of meaning, a feeling without hope, without use, without value. Some authors have distinguished between what they term chronic existential suffering, which they liken to a constellation of personality traits with ongoing doubts about meaning in life, forever beset by questions about why they were chosen to suffer, and never sensing any purpose in their life, and acute existential distress, occasioned by facing one's imminent mortality. It is, they argued, only in the latter case, acute existential distress in the face of terminal disease, that legitimates medical intervention. While such a distinction is presaged upon an already existing terminal illness, absent the illness and the imminent prospect of dying, existential suffering lacks any medical or psychiatric delineation. So many clinicians would argue, purely existential suffering scarcely justifies physician-assisted suicide or voluntary euthanasia, since the evaluation of existential suffering per se lies outside the competencies of physicians and psychiatrists. Yet it is perhaps this latter general existential suffering which seems to come close to the state of older people considering ending their lives, because of its perceived emptiness and purposelessness. Why go on when I am not living at all, merely existing? If physicians and psychiatrists can assess the intensity of suffering in one case, Why not then in other cases? Especially if one accepts with Cassel the unitary nature of suffering. The suicide of the Austrian writer and Auschwitz survivor Jean Améry in 1978 provides a particularly stark example of such suffering. His translator, John Barlow, described how Améry saw suicide, what he called voluntary death, as his preferring annihilation to the continuation of an existence lived in ignominy, desperate pain, or utter helplessness. Written 2 years before he killed himself, Améry's book on suicide provides what can in many ways be described as an account from the inside of what existential suffering is like, in someone who looked forward to his old age as little more than the further substantiation of the painfulness of life, when the moments of living grow shorter and shallower till they shrink to nothing. Linked to voluntary death arising in the context of such existential suffering is a condition known as tedium vitae, weariness of life, when the sheer length of life seems to serve as a cause of suffering. This issue is highlighted in another suicide, that of the American writer and scholar Caroline Heilbron. Like Améry, Heilbron announced her intention of ending her life some years ahead of her actual suicide. For her, life had not always felt meaningless, nor dogged by misfortune. In writing about women's lives after 60, however, she stated quite clearly that her own wish was not to live beyond 70, after, as she put it, the best of age had gone. In fact, she was 76 years old when, after completing a regular walk in Central Park with a friend, she returned home, finished off some correspondence, wrote a brief note, then swallowed a number of pills, put a bag over her head, and died. Her death was not occasioned by any terminal illness, nor by any serious psychiatric illness, or obvious chronic existential distress. Rather, she simply felt that she had had enough, and whatever remained of her life was no longer worth keeping. This notion of having lived long enough, of a completed life, led to a social movement termed in English of free will that was set up in the Netherlands some years ago by Yvonne van Baal. The goal of the movement is to assist older people who consider their life complete to end it. The group seeks to offer support to older people who consider they have reached or are reaching a point when more life is a prospect worse than death, enabling them to act upon their beliefs and embrace death. But free will specifically defines later life in older people as those who are 70 years of age and older, following the traditional notion that 70 years and 10 represents the normal extent of a human life, as outlined in Psalms 90, which notes moreover that though men's lives be so strong that they come to 80 years, yet is their strength then but labour and sorrow. In short, life extending beyond 70 has long been considered a period of labour and sorrow, and as such seems a source of suffering from which people might legitimately seek release. And, as DeLange has put it, suffering of old age is not life as it was meant to be by God. Although support for the right to an assisted death, a suicide pill, for those aged over 70 remains at a lower level than it is for those who are terminally ill, still such support is growing. Old age has long served as a permissive script to enable voluntary dying, whether as a rational suicide or as assisted dying. And as Caroline Heilbron wrote, is it not better to leave at the height of well-being rather than contemplate the inevitable decline and the burden one becomes upon others? For her, still alive, still writing in her mid-70s, yet there are no cures for ageing despair. For Heilbron, it was not so much the tedium vitae that oppressed her as that which awaited her. She felt her age and retirement were leaving her with few prospects for contributing to the world. And without that, she felt her later life was not merely one of limited pleasures and unlimited pains, but worst of all, endless years of uselessness. This sense of the unbearable weight of the years that underpins the of free will movement carries with it two related issues embedded in the lives and deaths of both Améry and Heilbronn. That with the coming of age, there is both an ending of opportunity to make something more of one's life and the sheer intractability that surrounds that position. To still feel worthy, to still be human, means to do the right thing, to recognise that one is free to do that right thing, and, as Améry put it, to take the road to the open. Even though life might still be bearable for both Améry and Heilbronn, it felt intolerable still to bear it. In conclusion, a number of writers have considered that suffering plays a meaningful part in constituting human life. They stress the importance of suffering as a virtue, a Christian sharing of what Christ experienced on the cross. While it is recognised, for example, in Pope John Paul II's encyclical, Evangelium Vitae, that the life of the body in its earthly state is not an absolute good, and thus need not be sustained at any price and under any conditions. Still, ending it can only be justified when it takes the form of self-sacrifice, rather than on the grounds of escaping from a particular level of suffering. The encyclical is critical in what it sees as a certain Promethean attitude, which leads people to think that they can control life and death by taking the decisions about them into their own hands. Disposing of the body is thus a violation of personhood, not the person merely disposing of one of his or her own once cherished earthly possessions. In this view, all living members of the human species are persons, beings of incomparable worth, bearers of rights that must be recognised by others and protected by society. And although human persons are more than their bodies, nonetheless they are bodily beings, and their bodies and their bodily life are not merely goods for the person, but goods of the person. And as long as there is in our midst a living human body, there is in our midst a living human person. What scope then is there for finding a place for assisted dying within the context of sustainable religious faith? For as Jones has put it, there remains a significant ecclesial consensus across Anglican, Catholic, Orthodox, nonconformist churches in opposition to legalised assisted suicide. While that is rightly the subject of another talk, it is important here to note that there are some theologians who do recognise the right to die, including the Anglican theologian Paul Badham and the Catholic theologian Hans Kahn, who argue that loving compassion, the injunction to love one another as one loves oneself, can make assisted dying a genuinely Christian approach to understanding of life. This is important, since such deaths afford to the individual the opportunity to restore the possibilities of a Christian deathbed, in contrast to the frequent ignominious ways of dying, with neither dignity nor virtue, alone in a pitiless hospital bed.